Welcome to Brazen Education with Educator Barnes, a podcast with a focus on speaking your truth, being transparent to help others, and having no shame about it. Because we can't move forward until the truth is known.
Well, welcome back to Brazen Education. I'm super excited. Today we have educator Tina Ahlgren on our podcast. And the reason I really wanted Tina on our podcast is because she is someone I admire when it comes to policy work. Because a lot of times when we think about laws and we think about policy, we think about people that are sitting in the state house. But any policy that is made in the state house, it has an impact on us, whether it's in the classroom or in our daily lives. And it's really important for people, especially educators, to be engaged in policy. So, Tina, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shantae. I'm so excited to be on today. I've always admired your work as far as bringing the truth to light in education, and you're willing to be honest with what's going on so that we can, as you said in your intro, move forward and make a better space in our community for our students and their families.
Well, thank you. And I know Tina well enough to know that she's going to be like, why are you saying this? But at one point in time, she was the teacher of the year for our state. And so that's super important to note. So like, that's like the high echelon of awards that you can get.
I was runner up. I didn't win.
Runner up, like you got up there. And the reason I mentioned that is because I remember that, and I remember all these articles that were covered about you, but then I remember like, oh, like there's this union thing she's involved in, and oh, she's speaking at the state house, and oh, she's involved in this work. And so there's a part of me that's like, she's an excellent educator. And then there's a part of me that's like, she does this policy work. So how did that intersect? How do you work becoming this excellent educator who also became this person who is well known, in my personal opinion, as being involved and engaged in policy work?
Yeah, so I think that would go back. My really first work in policy was probably around 2008. And so I started teaching straight out of college in Indianapolis Public Schools. And I had, so at that point, 2005 was when I started. So I'd been in about 3 years and, really starting to kind of hit my stride as far as feeling comfortable as an educator, starting to kind of get my feet under me. And that's when I really started just getting a little bit frustrated with some of the challenges kind of around me that I didn't see the solution as being immediately within my power or within even my, school's power, my school, sometimes even the school district's power. And so I would say I was really kind of starting to get burned out almost in a way, being frustrated with hitting a wall with regards to some things in education. And so the Teach Plus Policy Fellowship really came along for me at a perfect time in my career. And I say often, I think that's what's helped keep me in education is the work in policy. And it's given me a purpose at times when I've struggled to find the purpose in the classroom. And so that helped me find an outlet for that frustration at a time I needed it. So if you're not familiar with that policy fellowship, I was actually a part of that first cohort when it first came to Indianapolis. And the original goal was for it to be a 2-year fellowship where we learned for a year about what is policy? How does it work? How does the state house work? How are laws made? How can we as teachers impact that? And then the second year for us to kind of pick passion projects to take to the legislature. But weird things happened from almost day one of our fellowship. Big things started happening both at the state and national level with Race to the Top. And so the directors kind of came to us and were like, we are so sorry, but there is not time for education. Like, we need to throw you into the deep end right now. And so I often say that my policy work has actually kind of gone in reverse order. Some of the very first work I did was at the national level, which is wild to think about. And, I'm proud of that work. But I know when you had Andrea Hunley on, she often talks about that that big national work is not what impacts you day to day. So if you kind of look over the course of my policy work, from kind of started kind of at this almost big national and then state level, and now most of what I do is more local. because that just really gave me that foot in door of like, I have something to say. Educators don't often talk to legislatures. They don't hear from us, or if they do hear from us, it's the same people telling the same stories. And legislators genuinely do want to hear from us. And so with that fellowship, it kind of opened the door to me to explore how I could impact my students' lives in a positive way through this work. Now, one thing that's interesting is I think I haven't always stuck with one organization. So
Mhm.
I think I'm a little bit unique in the world of education and education policy, and that I have at one point or another kind of worked with all sides of the coin as far as education reform goes, and improving our educational environment, and sides that sometimes disagree with each other. And that's because
Yeah.
I really try to keep our students at the center of it. And so any conversation I'm having, anything that I take on, I always try to center our students and what the impact is to them. Um, and so the Teach Plus kind of got me launched. Then I did some work with some other organizations across the years who, reached out to say, we think that this would be a good opportunity for you. I remember sitting down with Governor Mitch Daniels once because an organization reached out and said, we think that they want to hear from you. And then really my work with the union, I'd been a member for many, many years. And when I was named IPS Teacher of the Year, we had a brand new superintendent. And a lot of the work that I had done prior to that time period had been around teacher retention and around the positive impact it has on our children when we can keep quality educators in the classroom. Some of that work around pay, but specifically around what it takes to retain quality teachers. And also at that time, there were kind of, again, the stars kind of aligned for me. I had all this policy experience with teacher retention. I was just named IPS Teacher of the Year. I had a brand new baby, a literal newborn, which was a nice sympathetic
Mhm.
face. And we had a new superintendent who really liked public relations and splashed my face all over billboards. And I also, we had been in a very, very long pay freeze in IPS.
Yes.
So we had not had raises or moved at all or had a contract actually in approximately 5 years.
Mhm.
And so all of this kind of aligned to the folks around me saying, okay, who can stand up and make a scene here? Who can afford to put themselves on the line for this issue? And it kind of, folks coming to me and saying like, Tina, you need to be the one to say something because Dr. Farabee cannot fire you. Basically was what they said is, he's touted you and your good qualities all around the city. You need to be the one to stand up and say, this is not okay. Right. And this is why. And so I really took on then the fight of within my district, helping improve our compensation packages and help therefore retaining teachers. And so that's really been where the bulk of my work has been since about 2015, is around local policy. Again, the finances of Indianapolis Public Schools, helping track those and make sure that we're getting the most that we can for our teachers while still being fiscally responsible moving forward. And what I think was really powerful about that piece is that it was then that the union came to me and said, okay, we see what you're doing. We want Dr. Farabee to have to actually look at you when we go to the table. And so it was kind of after all of that the union brought me on board saying, like, we want you on the bargaining team. And now I lead that team and help. Again, I bargain the contracts, including the most recent one that just passed last November.
Well, you hit
A
so
lot.
many different areas. And transparently, I also did a Teach Plus Policy Fellowship,
Mhm.
and it has morphed over the years. And I don't even remember which cohort I was in, but I know my cohort was 18 months, so we were a year and a half. And to Tina's point, the first year was just learning about like how bills become laws. And you wouldn't believe how many people don't really understand how that process worked. And then we kind of narrowed down on the leverage that you can pull. So from Teach Plus, that's actually how I started doing education writing. Because before that, I was literally doing gardening writing when I were telling you like how to cook your Brussels sprouts and how to grow them. That's literally what that was my writing content. And so they're like, no, you could actually write in a different way and move the needle and move the lever. And so Tina was one of the people that was mentioned during my cohort about someone that was successful in like taking all the tools we had learned, taking them and like being successful and moving the needle. And if you're listening today, one of the things that's super important is just becoming an informed person, like understanding the process, because a lot of times you hear from the same people because they have either the privilege or the flexibility to do so. So I've spoken at the State House before. Me speaking at the State House, I had to give up 8.5 hours of time because the first time I went, I sat for 4 hours. And right when the bill got called, I'm like, okay, I'm ready. And then they're like, we're going to go for recess and we'll call. I'm like, no. I took off of work. I've been sitting here for 4 hours. I haven't even eaten food, even though other people were legit eating food, but it was like my first time speaking. And I was like, I don't know if I should eat in this place or not. So then I had to take off of more work to come back to sit another 4 and some hours. And then finally they called my name. And then when I get up there, you see the clock that is counting down how many minutes you have to speak. And I wrote my thing out in advance. And I just remember feeling so much pressure when I was speaking. But when the legislator, the people there that started asking me questions, that's when I found my calm, because I'm like, oh, they actually heard me. And they actually asked like good follow-up questions. So even though that was like a long process to get my voice heard, I did indeed feel that it was worth it. And also Tina alluded to the fact that policy work is not just at the State House. It's also as local as being a part of the union. So before we started to air today, I told Tina I talked about her in my class. And so she doesn't know what I talked about. So she's finding out like live, real time right now. So it was like years. So one of the things I talk about, as most of you guys know, is the importance of saying names and spelling names correctly. And one day I was venting about this again because my name got either mispronounced or misspelled. And Tina saw it on Twitter. Well, X, formerly known as Twitter. And she's like, oh, I just introduced a MBI, which is a new business item about like this name education. And so I actually, because you can go and search your handle and someone else's handle to find where you've interacted. So I actually pulled the screenshots and I showed my students because we had been taught, I teach teaching and learning in middle school. And so almost every class, I talked to them about getting involved, even before they get a class from me, because I want them to understand the power of that. And I like showed the screenshots of the tweet, and then Tina responded back to say, hey, like this thing actually passed. And so it was just really cool that something I've been advocating for a very, very long time, like still like in this moment, like turned into someone like, oh, this is actually a serious thing. We should actually provide some guidance. We should provide some resources so people are saying their colleagues' name correctly. They're saying their students' names correctly. So I actually shared about that in class. And that really, I just remember looking at my pre-service teachers and they're like, oh, that's like so cool, Professor Barnes. So I just wanted to tell you, like, thank you, because it's sometimes it gets exhausting advocating for something and you feel like you're just in this silo screaming into the void. And then someone comes along, because I didn't call Tina to say, hey, introduce this thing. She's like, oh, I remember what you talked about. I introduced this thing. So there is power in policy. And sometimes you feel like you're doing work forever, but things move forward. So with that being said, can you tell us a little bit about like, I know you probably can't get into like specific strategies, but what things do you keep in mind when you think about negotiating or pushing forth the policy? You said you helped with the recent like bargaining contract. What things do you keep in mind? Because you have like the union views and the teachers' views, but you also have the district that also wants what they want. So how do you like gather information and prepare yourself for these type of negotiations, which turn into policies and contracts, things that are enforced, that your pay has a really real effect on what you actually do. So what goes into that work?
Yeah, so I kind of see two sides here. So like, I could talk about, what I do to decide what policy I'm going to like support and work on. I will at least briefly, though, talk about the union contract side. One of the very first things we do is survey our members and see what it is their priorities are. We ask questions about insurance and about compensation, which really is some of the very few things we actually can work on. But we reach out to the affinity groups in the district and see what their priorities are, which was a really big boon to us in this last contract. I can talk about that in just a moment. But we reached out to as many constituents as we can. And then I have a file right now on my computer for 526. And that is, I start accumulating now. When someone says, here's this problem that I encountered, here's this weird situation that no one ever thought of that has happened to me. And I try to put it there for, okay, when we're back at that table, when I'm preparing for this, what do I want to make sure not to forget? And so then a couple months ahead of time, I sit down and with my team and we set out our priorities, right? What have we heard from everyone? What have we seen? I do a ton of spreadsheets in the background, trying to figure out exactly how much money IPS has. And there's legal requirements around how much of it is allowed to go into the contract. And there are really dire consequences if you actually go over that amount. So, our goal is to push IPS as far as we can, while not risking overextending them. So, without going into too much detail, there's an example in Muncie where they overextended them and the teachers had to pay money back. So that's our worst case scenario, right? But I want to know that IPS has invested every penny that they can, right? And so I run a lot of spreadsheets, and often at that point in time, we don't know exactly what the student count will be. So I have our, best case, worst case kind of in between. And we prioritize what are things, and we split our list into two kind of buckets: what costs money and what doesn't. And so where can we advocate for things that cost them money, maybe more indirectly, or more quality of life kind of pieces, and what is directly going to cost them money. Now, again, the state has very narrowed our ability to negotiate, so we can only talk about salary and fringe related benefits. But part of that is time off, which is where a lot of our work came this last year. So this last year, one of our affinity groups raised up to us that our non-Christian religious staff members were being forced to take all of their personal days each year, and even sometimes unpaid days to attend their religious holidays, because we only get 2 personal days each year. And if you have 2 to 3 religious holidays that you have to take, because our calendar is more Christian based, then you don't get to take any personal days throughout the year. And so we were able to advocate to the district, and in this most recent contract added what are called 2 floating holidays, which for then folks can have 2 additional days to use as they see fit for whatever makes sense in their life. So for a lot of our, Jewish colleagues, that means taking off, the high holy days. Whereas, we also have Muslim colleagues that have other holidays. Our Mandarin teacher at my school just told me today that she's taking off Friday because she has a large Lunar New Year celebration coming up. For me personally, I'm actually using mine for the solar eclipse. My dad is a very huge astronomy buff, and he and I like to travel together to make sure that we can see the eclipse together. He's getting older, and I really want to spend that time with him. So for me, that's my floating holiday, like how I'm going to use my floating holiday. But I'm really proud of that work because it's taking into account the needs of our folks, and that's a way to improve, make our folks feel valued without necessarily costing a ton of money on the district side. And then we tried. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that was a good point. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then, fiscally, we try to be strategic and with how we deploy funds. We try to be as equitable as possible, which is really challenging because the reality is the last 20 years, really 15 years, there's been a lot of back and forth at State House that's made each contract kind of have different rules, and different groups have benefited in different ways. And but at the end of the day, there's only narrow guidelines in which we can write the contract, and so we do our best to get creative within the rules. I'm kind of proud of that. There's a group that reviews our contracts called IRB, the Employee Relations Board, and they are trying to make sure that we stick to to the letter of the law. And I get really excited when they kind of hand slap us and say, okay, that fits the letter of the law, but not quite the spirit, because that means that we really have, as between my union and the district, we've gotten creative to try to be as equitable as possible.
No, that's a great point, because a lot of times teachers are not treated as other professions. So like when you just mentioned about the floating holidays, like my husband has that for his job. That is like it's just like a general thing. And sometimes we don't think about the fact that you can't do all the things within a school break, because all the things may not literally happen during a school break, and you may need time off for other purposes. And we should have that, because those are the things that make us continue to choose this profession over and over again. You kind of alluded to being proud of this contract, but I'm curious, are there other pieces of policy, whether it's union, state house, that you were part of, that you were like, I'm really proud I was a part of that, and I really felt like the work that I did really moved the needle?
So I would really say around teacher retention and IPS, and that's not one piece of like policy, but I actually had the opportunity a couple of months ago to do a story slam kind of event. And what I ended up doing, because I was researching my own journey through this policy, I actually ended up just reading clips from newspapers across the last like 15 years. And I actually ended up like crying when I was putting it all together, because it was 15 years of tiny policy and structure wins that, when you put them all together, painted this big picture of like, oh my gosh, like I've had this impact. And so it started with a Teach Plus policy brief that we wrote, again, I think it was 2008-9, called The Cost of Loyalty, where we laid out the fact that IPS at that point was actually the lowest paid across all the districts in Marion County, except for like 1 year at Speedway. And that was before the pay freeze. So, right, like we were already the lowest. And then when the pay freeze hit, I mean, it became a massive difference, right? And so through that, one of the articles that I was quoted in talked about the retention rate of IPS that year, which was like, there was one summer that we turned over almost half of our teachers in a year. Which is insane, right? And it's detrimental to kids, right? Detrimental to kids, and costs a lot of money for no reason, right? Like recruitment and retention is also a fiscal issue, right? We have to train new employees. We have to, I mean, there's so much to it. But as we went on, and you could see kind of the wins and the setbacks, right? So getting Dr. Farabee to make a commitment that we were going to have that first contract. So the group that I was working with at the time in 2014, like, and literally newborn on my shoulder, going in front of cameras and saying, I have to choose between paying for daycare and my IPS kids, right? And we had this whole barrage assault planned, but I mean, pretty quickly, Dr. Farabee came and said, hold up. We promise we'll do a contract. We haven't done one in years, but we'll do a contract. We'll get a raise. We'll figure it out. And he actually made me do a press conference, because he was like, I need you to stop. And so, from that moment, watching each win in each contract. And I mean, one of my favorite things is like, you're so excited about this first contract back with Farabee, but the reality is that there was actually no money for it. And we talked about those legal bounds about the money. And so it was actually, there was actually no raise. It was just a stipend in that very first contract, but we had a contract for the first time in 5 years. Then the next one, we were able to give some raises for the first time, but for some people it was like $800 after 5 years of nothing. So there was a lot of step forward, step back. And again, that with that particular contract, which I believe was 15, 16, 17 that in there, that's one where the state was like, we do not like what you did. Like you tried to be equitable. We don't like that. So we have to, like, they completely changed the rules on me, like, because they didn't like basically what I did, to try to make, what I basically did was I indexed how much each not each individual employee, but each level had been impacted by the pay freeze, and then distributed the funds according to that kind of index of how much they'd been impacted, because it was very different depending on where you were in your career. And it was kind of odd how it worked out. I mean, it was like, for instance, if you were in your 20, you were about to go into a stalled portion of our pay scale anyway. So you actually didn't lose anything other than cost of living increases. Whereas if you were in year 19, you were about to get a big bump, and you would have had that for the next few years. So each individual group was affected differently, but the state came back and said, in the future, everybody gets the same, right? So they tried to reduce that. And so again, then we got more creative and pushed back in different directions. And in fact, as you know, our big pay raise in IPS came 2019 with the referendum that was passed in 2018. And part of that was we had to lobby at the State House and say, okay, we know we have this referendum coming. We need the freedom to use it how we want, and not like, if I have to give the exact same amount to every person, that's not going to fix our problem. And so we were able to get basically a 1-year reprieve from the state to distribute funds to make up for the recession however we wanted. And it was not a coincidence that lined up with the year that IPS had the referendum funds, because we wanted to make sure that we had that opportunity. And again, I'm proud of all the work that went into that.
But a lot that you're talking about is about strategy. And I think sometimes people don't think about that, because I worked in IPS for 3 years, and so I was in Wayne for a while. I was in Washington Township, and then I came to IPS, and I was a teacher leader for the 3 years I was there. So I was getting a stipend on top of my salary. But I remember it was like within the first week I worked there, another employee looked me up, because at the time, IPS, if you got hired, they publish your salary in the board report, which they don't do. They don't do that practice anymore under Dr. Johnson. And someone said to me, "You just got here and you're making more money. You had fewer years of experience. You just got to our district and you're making more money than I am." And so and I wanted to give that tangible example, because that's one of the things that Tina is talking about how depending on where you were, how you came in the district, your salary could be a bit off. And it really wasn't fair, because giving everybody else the same thing actually doesn't fix the fact that I was here. So essentially, if you came into IPS like after this pay free thing, you were at a different level than people who pay was frozen. And so those people were salty, and they should have been salty because everybody getting the same, that actually didn't fix the issue that I didn't get any raises this whole entire time. And then at that time, IPS continued that stipend model where they were giving you these stipends if you were doing teacher leader work on top of your salary, which for some people, they were like, oh, this is a little bit different. So also in policy work, it's like the consequences and the unintended consequences, following the law, the lawmakers not liking what you did, so we're going to change stuff on you, trying to find a way around the law, trying to get like an out. Like there's all of these different things that you have to deal with. So we talked a lot about things that are in the past, but right now the legislature is in session, and there's a lot of stuff popping off. And I assume that there are some topics that you are just fired up about. So what are some topics, as much as you're comfortable with sharing with us, you're fired up about, and if you're comfortable sharing about your views or like your concerns, and for those who don't understand, how a bill goes in is not how it ends up, because there's things that get taken out, added, continue, writers, things that are slid in. But as they are now on February 7th, 2024, what thoughts and concerns do you have? What bills are keeping you up at night?
Well, interestingly enough, they're not mostly education bills, which is rare for me in a session. So I should probably add that I know a couple of months ago you had on Andrea Hundley, who I haven't mentioned yet, was my principal right before, for a number of years before she became the state senator, and she's a huge source of inspiration for me. But she kind of helped spur me in the direction pretty early on in my time working for her. that, you know what, like some of these issues that, I'm running into that I want to help my students and I want to help with aren't going to be solved with education policy, right? Like, so she kind of started pushing me a little bit more outside of my comfort zone with education policy, which I could talk about all day. But, she said, where else and what other things are happening in policy that impact our students and impact our families? I know she talked quite a bit about gun safety and those pieces. For me, some of the pieces outside of education policy I've really focused on the last few years have been mental health care access, and have been, food access in our community. And currently, one of my big kind of hills I'm on is public transportation access. And so I ran for office for the first time in 2018, just to be a delegate to the Indiana State Convention, just to get a feel for like what it's like to have your name on that ballot. But I quickly, or sorry, actually I say 2018, it was 2020. Not only did that become virtual, but I quickly realized like, okay, I like this piece, but it's not very impactful. And then I actually in 2022 ran to become my precinct committee person for the neighborhood. So I am the lowest level of elected government in my neighborhood, but that's given me a door into conversations about things that are not education policy with local community leaders. And so a part of that has been a lot of work around, as I said, mental health care access. I'm really proud of the city of Indianapolis and the work that we've been able to do over the last year and a half. So if you don't know, Indianapolis, for the first time, it actually just debuted in the East District last week, but we have a mental health crisis response team that is non-law enforcement that goes out when someone calls with a mental health crisis. That, again, that's not an accident. They came from organizations in this community working and pushing the mayor's office to make that happen. Similarly, then we went to the State House. Senate Bill 1 last year in the 2023 session was helping fund programs like that. One of the organizations I worked with, ACT Indiana, their idea was, we want someone to call, someone to come who is not a police officer, and somewhere to go. And a lot of success around that. And those same groups now have picked up work with the low barrier shelter that is planned for downtown Indianapolis, and specifically public transportation, because that does allow access to a lot of folks in our community to work. Expands their options, and expanding their mobility again is like access to quality transportation is one of the biggest factors toward economic mobility that exists. So I say that to say, in Indianapolis, we have had the Red Line that opened for rapid transit up and down the Meridian Street corridor. The Purple Line along 38th Street is just about to open. And in my neighborhood, we're about to get, in theory, the Blue Line going down Washington Street. And again, knowing families that live up and down Washington Street, knowing the schools that would receive greater access to students by the Blue Line being along Washington Street, I'm a big advocate for the Blue Line and for the infrastructure changes that will come along with the Blue Line that will also make that street safer. Right now, 6 to 8 people a year die on Washington Street, and many, many more are injured significantly. And so the infrastructure changes that come with the Blue Line should, by all research, make it also safer. It reduces the amount of areas of conflict for pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorists. But currently that's under attack at the State House. So a lot of my work so far, if you're stalking my Twitter, that most recently you'll see a lot about Senate Bill 52. So Senate Bill 52 is on the surface attempting to eliminate the designated lane portion of the Blue Line, which would be the part where the bus gets its own lane. But what they know is that it would actually kill it entirely, because if we don't have designated lanes, the federal funding gets pulled, which is half of the project. So the legislators are picking a little bit at Indianapolis right now. The other thing that's in that bill is the no turn on red signs that were added downtown would be eliminated. So, things that are clearly public safety oriented with no reason to remove them, are being under attack. And I think part of what this is a little bit personal for me is that we've seen in education for a long time the state house pick at Indianapolis public schools specifically, like writing
Yes.
bills that, legally they can't just say Indianapolis public schools, but they find a way to narrowly define us, to make legislation that impacts only us. And now we're seeing the same thing happen with our city as a whole, and not allowing us to make the decisions that are best for our citizens, and that our citizens have voted for. And so I really take offense at that idea that, particularly when there are things that are to improve our public life, that we would just throw those out because someone has a vendetta at the state house, right?
And if you're not familiar with, and if you're not familiar with Indianapolis per se, because I know people listen from various places, our city county council pass things, and then what we find, those of us that live in Indianapolis, at the state house, other laws that are passed that essentially undo the things that are passed. Like, because when you talked about the no turn on red, like my husband works downtown, he works in the government center, that's where he works at. So when I have to go down there for whatever reason for him at work, I'm just like, it's so stressful because people are legit trying to turn on red. They're trying to do all these things. I'm like, that's why we're trying to put these safety things in. And so when you think about this whole entire state, to have a policy affect the place where and then also it's the state house. So you have people that show up to Indianapolis who are not from Indianapolis. That may be the first time they're there, and they're trying to navigate all the one-way streets and how we just go in the circle and trying to find a park and all those things. So the stop, in my personal opinion, is those would help people oh, I can stop, read the signs, see which way. Oh, this is a one-way street. I cannot go this way. This is dangerous. So that's the other thing with Tina's point. They don't come out and say they're targeting the capital city, but we know it's targeting the capital city. And there's been a lot of push here about the public transit. I have been following Wild Style. I can't remember his last name, it's escaping me. And he's been doing a great job advocating for public transit, and also trying to inform citizens about, because you hear a lot of people well, the bus is annoying, and I'm like me, transparently, the last time I rode on the bus, it was Metro bus. That, it wasn't even called Indigo. It was called something totally else. When I moved here when I was 3, and I rode the bus because my parents had one vehicle. So you have people saying I don't want transportation who literally have not been on the bus and don't understand that, yes, we're not Chicago, no, we're not New York, no, we're not DC, but we have the All-Star game coming here, and people are coming to our city expecting oh, I'm well, you have to come downtown. Then you can go back out to where you want to go. We don't, and it's probably going to be another half hour before the bus comes because we haven't set up the infrastructure for the bus. And then the tragedies that Tina mentioned are real, because even I live on the northwest side of Indianapolis, and there's a grocery store in particular that I patronize. People get killed by that grocery store all the time, and there's several different Indigo bus stops, but there's no they're literally walking in the street because we don't have the lanes and the things set up for them. And so it's we want to keep people alive. This should be simple, but is really important to get involved. So I know we're kind of getting close to a close. So Tina, if someone was sitting here listening to you, okay, I'm fired up, I should do something, and then they're like, man, what should I do? What advice do you have to someone who's I am new to this. I hear you, Tina. I believe you. I need to do something, but I have no clue what even a first step would be. What advice would you have for someone just trying to get their toes in the water, take a first step?
Well, I know one of the things you talked about is this process is not meant to be accessible. So I want to start by saying there is no way, even I cannot follow it all. I cannot act on it all. So part of it is I try to find organizations that I trust. There are many, many, many public organizations in the state. You can find one who helps you. For me, again, those I tend to follow my state teachers unions. I'm what are they saying? Again, that Teach Plus, because they have that little bit of an educator perspective. I'm reading Chalkbeat. Again, more recently working with a group called Faith in Indiana or ACT Indiana to see the kind of more non-education policy stuff. And I like, what are they looking at? Like, what are, reading their newsletters, saying, and finding something that I'm passionate about and where I feel like my voice would actually be useful. So that's one of the challenges. I know when you talked to Andrea Hunley again, you talked about that value of it has to be really your story for it to be impactful. And so thinking about which of these bills, which of these areas can I actually speak on and have it be a unique voice. So sometimes that's a little bit challenging. So I know, again, Andrea has always been this great voice of reason for me. So when the bills were going through the State House in 2023, and there was a bill that was really trying to end our ability to talk about racism, to be able to talk about other issues in
House Bill
in our classrooms.
1134. We have
Yes.
not forgotten.
Yeah, that really was 2 years in a row of trying to go through. And, I said to Andrea, like, hey, do I really have a unique voice here? Like, what is, because even though it was something I was really passionate about, I wasn't sure that I was the right person to speak on it. Now, she helped me find that unique voice and talking about some of the lessons that I do and how even I, in a very welcoming school district with a very supportive administrator, like would feel like afraid to speak. But, really, what I would say, like, find that space, because then you're talking from your heart, right? You're telling your story and you're not relying on somebody else, and like that focus on that one piece of legislation or that one area first. And again, it helps to know what other organizations are doing so that you can also sometimes just pitch in and help them. So again, all of these organizations, like I always say, I'm not a good organizer. Like, I am not the person to fully organize your campaign, because like whether it's a campaign again toward mental health crisis or campaign toward literally getting elected, I'm not the person to organize it, because like as a teacher, our lives are too busy for me to commit to that full piece.
Yes.
But like tell me what you're doing and I'm going to see where I can pitch in, and I can see where my voice is going to be actually useful. I do want to say though, because I want to be cognizant that I try to be very careful not to speak over folks too, to be like cognizant of, is this a place where I think I know what's right and I'm speaking over people who know better? And that's part of where those organizations come in as well. I want to give a huge shout out to Faith in Indiana, because they, for me, are a huge way to connect to folks all over the city and get to hear from those folks and really make sure that what I'm fighting for is really what they want, right? As opposed to like me out here on this crusade thinking I'm solving a problem when really that's not what the community actually wants. Because it's so easy as a white woman to try to speak over folks. And so instead I try to be cognizant and, elevate their voices where I can. And sometimes that's even supporting them and their testimony efforts. So I didn't get a chance to talk about House Bill 1047. That's another one that is on my radar for this thing, in part because I have a friend who that bill is about AI revenge porn, which does not sound in any way related to my other work. But we do have a teacher in this city whose students last year made AI porn of her and distributed it not only to her students, but to her sons. And so
Wow.
she's been, she came to me and she said, I know you work in policy, like what can we do? And so, I wouldn't say that we like led the charge, but kind of behind the scenes talking to Andrea and other folks, like, what can we do? And now there is this House Bill 1047, which should close the loophole that allowed those folks to kind of get off of major consequences, because prior to this bill, if it passes, revenge porn had to be taken in person. So like the image had to be made while both people were together. So AI generated was like a loophole in this law, and that's both federal law and state law. And so I say all that to say, like, part of that's like elevating her voice. Like, I didn't have a story to tell there, right? But to be able to like connect her to the people and say, this is what happened to her. Like she doesn't want this to all be for naught. Like, she wants something to change out of this. And so now it's like helping prep her to testify as this bill goes through the process. But, it's really just starting small, like what is something that you care about and your voice is unique, and going there. Sorry, I could talk about
No,
this
those are
forever. So
great.
I'm like, what did I?
Yeah,
Okay,
I
what did
know,
say? I'll
I
keep saying
know,
today.
but no, those are great. Those are great points because the time I spoke at the State House, I've only spoken one time. I was asked many times before that and many times after that. And the thing that got me at the State House was about school discipline because it impacted me personally as a student in Indiana. It impacted my children and it impacted my students. And I had a story that I'm like, I can tell this story because sometimes like House Bill 1134, which they dubbed the anti-CRT bill, I was passionately against what was happening, but I didn't feel like, to your point, like I had a unique viewpoint, and also I wasn't in the classroom anymore. So I also felt like I would be talking over people who are currently in the classroom. So what I actually did during that time, which many people don't know, I like spoke to people who, and I don't even know if some of those people spoke or not spoke, like how do you stay within the time limit? How do you craft an argument? What is the process? Because if you don't sign up, you just can't show up and get in line. That's not how it works. So, like when I sat for 4 hours, I signed in 4 hours ago and waited for them to call the bill. So, even just explaining the process to people, because sometimes you can be involved in policy without being the person that's mouth is open and saying the things. You can be helping by explaining the process, or this is how you do a good argument, or be prepared for them to ask you questions. Be prepared to answer with questions. If you can cite a source, some research, that will be great. Here's a person that you can connect with, because there's always groups, to Tina's point, there's always groups that their job is to go through the research and the articles, and they will send you articles and send you stuff, not necessarily to influence what you say, but to take some of the work off the table, that you don't have to feel like you have to go in the archives in the library at night to find this stuff. They have found it for you, and then you can look at what you want, and then use that for your testimony or whatever purposes that you have. Oh, I have so many questions, and I know we're pretty much out of time.
I
So,
know.
Tina,
You'll
what
have to have me
are
back.
I will. So, final thoughts. What are your final thoughts about education policy and teachers? And if teachers were going to go do something like this week, before this week is over, what is the one thing that you would want them to do, especially teachers that are in Indiana while the session is currently open?
Ooh, while the session is currently open. So, number one, I think don't be naive to think that like you can be above this, like that you can sit on the sidelines and not be political, because our jobs are inherently political, like whether we like it or not. And policy is going to impact us one way or the other. So like you can either sit back and let it happen, or you can be a part of the process. And again, our professions are not designed to allow us to really engage with this, right? I think our profession is so overwhelming that it's like in its own right, that even beginning to take on this work can be intimidating for a lot of people. But it will happen to you whether you like it or not, right? These policies will impact you. And so there's a couple of policies that are education related that right now I think it's worth folks looking at. I say that because they're not things that I don't want to say super passionate about, but like I feel like I don't have a unique voice, but maybe somebody else out there does. So right now, House Bill 1073 is about putting cameras in specific parts of schools, specifically around special education students and areas where there's like seclusion or restraint. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, right? Like I want to protect our kids. I want to make sure that like schools are doing what they're supposed to be doing to keep them safe. But at the same time, like we've often learned that cameras can be a slippery slope to insert them in individual classroom areas. So, I mean, I think there's not a huge slide from a camera in that classroom to a camera in every classroom, which again could be, oh, we want to monitor discipline. But, we just had yesterday in the state of Indiana, Attorney General Todd Rokita drop the Eyes on Education portal, which if you don't know is a portal where anyone can go on and without verification report schools and districts and individual teachers for what is essentially legal discussion of LGBTQ plus issues and racism. That's really what they're targeting. They call it indoctrination. But and it goes up on the website unchecked, unverified. And so I can only imagine, again, if we had cameras in our classrooms, where that goes. But again, the whole point of that House Bill 1073 is, I think, is an important bill. I am not personally sure how I feel about it. And so I feel like the folks who are in those roles, like, really need to be there, making sure it's clear, like, that their opinions are getting heard. Another big education bill going through that is Senate Bill 50, which is about having chaplains in the schools. This is a little bit interesting.
And
actually,
did your pastor speak about that bill?
He did.
Bill?
Yeah, Gray Lassane, the head of Christ Church Cathedral, Indianapolis, downtown, went over, and he spoke about, students' religious freedoms, and how he was concerned that this would actually negatively impact students' religious freedoms, and particularly, so he actually spoke against the bill. But there's a lot of concerns about students being feeling pressured to interact with chaplains who are from a faith tradition that's not their own. In part, it's actually kind of billed as like a replacement for school counselors, which is also a little bit concerning. And there seems to be no duty to report anything that's heard. So there's a lot of concerns around that. But again, it's not something that I personally have been working on. But I think that folks who are more informed, particularly, again, school counselors, area, could really have an impact there.
Well, thanks for sharing that information, because that was super helpful, especially about the video cameras. And I do think there was a case in Brownsburg last school year with a kid that was special needs, that was forced to do something, and that person ended up being terminated. So in the back of my mind, I wonder, and again, this is not a bill that I'm following particularly closely, because again, I don't have a unique, and that's not my role, but I wonder if on the other side, that is the why to that, and that is not me being for or against, because I'm not informed enough to tell y'all for or against. So I think about that. And also, I think people need to keep an eye out about what the Attorney General is doing with this Eyes on Education portal, especially because when we think of government, we think that government is going to put verified, fact-checked information out into the public forum. So me personally, regardless of how you feel, we all, I believe, should have some questions about that. And then an article in Chalkbeat Indiana. If you're not following Chalkbeat Indiana, you really should do so. Also sign up for their text messages for the session, because they send you every single day like an overview of things that are happening there to keep you informed. But they wrote a decent article about the fact that the schools that were being reported when it launched, they had no clue. Like, they didn't even know they were on it until they're finding out and getting called by the media about it, which is problematic, because if the whole goal, if something wrong is happening in your school, to fix it, you would think you would start at the school. So just gonna leave that out there. But Tina, I always love talking to you and having you on, and I definitely I may have to make a habit of having you here for every single session, so you can give us like the rundown and advice. But I just want educators and just people in general, because half of my audience is actually not educators. I just want people in general to feel like they can be an engaged citizen, because I think sometimes, especially during the pandemic, I think people kind of lost heart about, like, I can actually create change in our society. And I think we have to keep hope alive and believe that, yes, you at home, you can actually create change in our society, even if it's a little change, or even if your change is just helping someone else push something forward. So thank you for being here. I'm definitely going to have Tina back here on the show. And I will see you all on the next episode.
Thank you, Shante.